The only Shakespeare play I ever really liked was Macbeth. And I'm not sure why I like Macbeth. I think because it's about a Scotsman, a Scottish laird who became the king. But in the play, Macbeth makes this very famous statement about life. Jeremy, I think we have that on the screen. I want to put it up here. You've heard this before. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's Act 5, Scene 5. Is that true? Is life nothing but a tale told by an idiot? Is life just totally meaningless in that it signifies nothing? Is history simply this cycle that goes round and round and round with no meaning or purpose? I think those are questions a lot of people ask. And I'd like for the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk to speak to some of those questions. Habakkuk is an example of a person who is living in the midst of tumultuous circumstances, confusing times, and wondering if there really was any meaning to life, wondering if God was really there, if God was present. And I want him to speak to these questions and these issues. Give you a little background about Habakkuk. He probably lived and preached near the end of the 7th century before Christ. It was a time when the Assyrian Empire was coming to an end as world power, and the Babylonian Empire was on the rise. And in Habakkuk's own home country of Judah, tyranny, lawlessness, injustice were rampant. In fact, the first 4 verses of the book describe the situation in Judah. Would you find a Bible, please? And I'm not going to have a lot of verses up here. Matter of fact, you can take that off now, right now. But I only have one at the very end of the lesson. So I'd like you to look at Habakkuk. Can you find it there somewhere in the Old Testament? I'd like you to turn and read the passages, because I do have a number of scriptures that I want to read from this great Old Testament book. But the first 4 verses of chapter 1 describe what was happening in the nation of Judah. He has a complaint about his country. Listen. Why do you, the you there, that's God. He's talking to God. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. That's verses 3 and 4. Now the prophet's real concern in all of this tumult and all of this confusion is that God doesn't seem to be doing anything. God doesn't seem to be speaking. God doesn't seem to be there. His presence is not felt. And in verse 2 of chapter 1, Habakkuk challenges God and he says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help and you don't listen?" I think his openness and his candor surprises a lot of people. I mean, can you talk to God like that? Can we question God in that way? Doesn't that show a lack of faith? And I would say not at all. Not at all. The important thing to notice about Habakkuk is that while he has some questions, and while he may have some doubts about what God's doing, he is willing to express that to God. He doesn't leave God out of the picture. And this is where a lot of folks make a very serious mistake. Now, let me tell you, if you're a thinking person, if you are engaged in life at all, you're going to have some questions. You're going to have some doubts about what God is doing and how He's doing it. But if we bring those questions to Him, and if we seek His help with them, then we usually will arrive at an answer or a solution of some sort. But if we turn away from Him in unbelief, if we say, well, I can't believe in a God who do that, or a God who says this or doesn't say that, if we throw the Scripture away, if we become bitter, if we isolate ourselves from other believers, then we're in serious trouble. So in your doubts and in your questions, and you have them, don't deny that, but in all of that, don't leave God out of the picture. Bring it to God as Habakkuk did. Now, when you go on down into the chapter in verses 5 through 11, we have the Lord's first response to Habakkuk's question. And look at verse 5 and the first part of verse 6. God says, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians." In other words, God is saying, I'm going to deal with the situation in Judah. I am going to bring judgment on my people. I am going to discipline my people, and I'm going to use that cruel, ruthless people known as the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to do it. And just notice some of the descriptive phrases that God uses to describe the Babylonians. In verse 7, they're a law unto themselves. In verse 9, they're intent on violence. In verse 10, they mock kings and they scoff at rulers. In verse 11, their own strength is their God. Isn't that last phrase telling? Their own strength is their God. Any nation or person or church that worships its own strength is in serious trouble. That's the Babylonians, though. So God is going to use this ruthless, impetuous, fearsome, dreadful, violent nation to punish his own people. That's outrageous. At least that's what Habakkuk thinks. He's horrified at the prospect of the Babylonians being the instrument of God's judgment against his own people. I tried to think of some parallel, and this isn't really a good one, but maybe it would be something like if we said that God is going to discipline the United States and he's going to use North Korea to do it. We'd say, no, you don't do that, God. I mean, that bunch of atheists and they don't believe in you and they're so oppressive. But what if God said, I'm going to discipline you Americans, and it's going to be the North Koreans who do it? That's kind of what Habakkuk was hearing. I'm going to discipline my people, and it's going to be the Babylonians who do it. Listen to Habakkuk in chapter 1, verse 13, because then he responds to God. He said, "Why are you silent when the wicked," that's the Babylonians, "swallow up those more righteous than themselves," that's the Judeans or the Hebrews? See, it just doesn't seem to be fair, at least to Habakkuk, for God to use such a wicked nation to punish his own people. And then to make his point, he gives his own description of Babylon. God's described them, and then in chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, Habakkuk kind of describes how he feels about the Babylonians. And there's one statement that I want to comment about. Habakkuk says, "Therefore he," and that's Babylon, "sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet." That's in verse 15. That's a metaphor about how the Babylonians worshipped the things that brought them power. Their power was like this net that went out and just swept in everything from the sea. And he said, and so they worshiped their net, and they burned sacrifices to their dragnet. And you might be thinking, well, that's kind of a foolish metaphor to use. Nobody worships a fish net. Is that right? We do. Do you know, in our culture, we worship green paper. It's a $20 bill if you can't say it. If we're not careful in how we live life and how we view life, our worldview, we end up worshiping a piece of green paper. There are people in our community who would literally kill me to have this piece of paper. There are people who lie, steal, cheat, go against all the values they know to be true to have that green paper. We worship the thing, if we're not careful, that brings us power. We have to be very careful about that. The Babylonians, they were worshiping that which brought them power. And if we're not careful, folks, we end up doing exactly the same thing. That's just Habakkuk's description, though. And yet, even though Habakkuk doesn't understand why God's going to use the Babylonians, I want you to notice his response in chapter 2, verse 1. He says, I will stand my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint. He says, I don't know. I don't understand why God's going to do this. I would do it differently, but I'm going to wait on the Lord. Did you notice so many of our songs had that theme? Waiting on the Lord, being patient, waiting for the Lord to act. That idea of waiting on the Lord is used elsewhere in the book of Habakkuk. And it's a lesson that I think we would do well to learn. See, typically, we Americans are so impatient. We want answers for every question. We want solutions for every problem. We want a healing for every sickness. And we want it now. And we could learn something from this prophet. He says that even though he doesn't understand what God is doing, he is going to go up on the walls of the city, and he's going to sit down, and he's going to wait to see what God will do. In other words, Habakkuk is determined to let God talk to him. He wanted to get his thinking in line with God's, not the other way around. And isn't it true that so often we do it the other way around? We say, God, you need to get in line with me. You need to line up with how I think things ought to be done and the way I'm thinking. And Habakkuk is saying, I'm going to sit down here and I'm going to see what God's going to do, and I want to line up my thinking with his. We would do well to learn that lesson. And I think in all of this, the prophet provides us with such a great example to follow. Listen to me. Teenagers, listen to me. There's a time when you need to shut off your cell phones and shut down your iPads and your computers and your TVs and sit patiently and listen for God to speak to you and watch for the way that he acts. We all need to do that. It is so hard. It is almost impossible, but there's a time when that needs to happen. And along those lines, the prophet says, here's a pretty famous verse, chapter 2, verse 20, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Be silent, wait, listen. And in 3:16, he says, yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come to the nation invading us. We need times to wait, to listen, to watch, and to see what God's doing. I just urge you to find those kind of times in your life. Now, in chapter 2, verse 2, going back to that, God answers Habakkuk a second time, and he tells him that even though he's going to use Babylon as the instrument of his judgment, Babylon will not escape judgment either. Notice his words in chapter 2, verse 3. For the revelation waits an appointed time. It speaks to the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay. In other words, God is always right on time. He acts at exactly the right moment. God is never too early. God is never too late. But at exactly the right time and in the right way, God acts. Now, in the midst of God's words about the wickedness of Babylon, we find this remarkable statement about the righteous. Chapter 2, verse 4. The righteous person will live by faith. Do you know that's quoted several times in the New Testament? Romans chapter 1, verse 17. Galatians chapter 3, 11. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. Wow, that must be pretty important. The righteous will live by faith. To find Habakkuk quoted in the New Testament, I bet a lot of people didn't even know that. But that's where that statement comes from Paul and the writer of the Hebrew letter. In marked contrast to those who are going to feel the wrath of God, there is a righteous remnant characterized by one thing, their faith in God. And the history of Israel and the history of the church bear this out. There has always been that remnant that exhibits trust and dependence on the living God. No matter what happens, no matter what tragedies occur, no matter how unfaithful and godless the masses become, there is always a righteous remnant that walks by faith. That is greatly encouraging to me. And I'll tell you what, I want to be part of that remnant, don't you? I want to be one of those people who walk by faith and not by sight. Now, going on, chapter 3 is Habakkuk's prayer response to God. And he asks God to act on behalf of his beleaguered people and to do some of the mighty things he had done before. It seems to me that Habakkuk finally understood how God can use a wicked people to accomplish his righteous will. Listen, chapter 3, verses 13 and 14. You came to deliver your people, to save your anointed one, speaking about Judah, speaking about Israel. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear, you pierced his head. That really got my attention. With his own spear, you pierced the head of the wicked leader of this land. See, God's always done that sort of thing. He has always used the very tools and the very acts of wickedness to accomplish his will. You want some examples? Joseph's brothers, back in the book of Genesis, they did a very wicked thing. They took this 17-year-old brother that they hated, and they sold him into Egyptian slavery. Wicked thing. And yet, God, we're told by Joseph, intended it for good to accomplish the saving of many lives. Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. God takes this wicked act, rooted in hatred and envy and jealousy, and he uses it to save his people. He's always done that. And this example came to mind. How was the wicked giant Goliath killed? Not with the stone from David's sling. That brought him down. But if you read in 1 Samuel 18:51, David took Goliath's sword and he cut his head off. That's how he killed him. The very instrument that terrified and threatened the armies of Israel, that very instrument was used to put an end to those threats. God is able to do that. And of course, the greatest example of that is the cross. Crucifixion had to be the most cruel, painful method of execution ever devised by human beings. And yet it is the very instrument through which God reveals his grace and his mercy. Satan's own weapon, his own terrible device, was used to defeat him. That's the power of our God, folks. That's what God does. He takes the very evil things. He takes the spear of the Babylonians and he runs it right through their head. And God's always able to take that which is bad and evil, and it is that, but he uses it for his good. That's the power of God. Now, to finish, Habakkuk is not naive. He's well aware of what the Babylonians can and what they are going to do. He knows their terrible exploits, but he does not give up his confidence in God. In fact, Jeremy, I think we've got this one on the screen. This, just listen to this. This is the latter part of the book, the last part of the book. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread the heights. That has to be one of the most joyful affirmations of faith anywhere in Scripture. In modern language, it might read like this. Even if I lose my job, and my health fails, and the forces of evil seem to have everything their way, and even though the economy fails and the election doesn't turn out like I hoped it would, and even though I'm not appreciated by my associates and everything in life goes wrong, I won't pull the plug on God. I may have doubts, I may have questions, but I will not stop trusting him. I will not stop rejoicing. He is my rock and he is my strength. What a tremendous statement to make. That's where I want to be. I'm not saying I'm there all the time, but that's where I want to be. Because life has all of those things in it. Life never works out like you think it ought to. There are always, as Keith was pointing out, those darker times, those harder times, those desert times. But we don't give up our faith in God. As I end the lesson, I want to ask you some questions. Do you have any doubts about God, maybe what He's doing and how He's doing things? You ever troubled by His silence? I am. I know we've had a little rain lately, but we're still in the midst of drought. And you know, I have to say, God, there are thousands of people praying for rain. Why don't you send it? I have questions like that. I can answer yes to what I've just asked you. Now, some people resolve those questions by just simply getting rid of God, as if that were possible. But they've actually solved nothing. If you say, I don't believe in God anymore, He did this or He didn't do that, don't believe, you've solved nothing. You've only introduced even greater questions and problems. The best thing for us to do, seems to me, to do what Habakkuk did, and that is to wait on the Lord. To wait patiently on the Lord. And as we do, answers will be given. Understanding will come in God's own time. But let's keep our faith. Let's keep our trust in His wisdom and in His power. Never let go of that, my friends. No matter what happens, never let go of that. And I think this last song that we're going to sing is a great illustration of that. It is well with my soul. When peace like a river attends my way, or when sorrows like sea billows roar, whatever it is, we put our trust in God. Let's stand together and sing this song.